Hi everyone, it's Thorn. So in the video that I posted last week, I talked about what we might call micro identities in witchcraft, which is kind of this tendency that we're seeing increasingly and really has been prevalent for several years, where it's not enough, seemingly, to identify as a witch. Now people identify as green witches or sea witches or cosmic witches or crystal witches. And if this is something that's kind of outside of your immediate experience, if you've been practicing for, let's say, several decades and you're getting on various social media platforms for the first time and you're seeing this, it can be kind of bewildering in the sense that, like, what do these things mean? Is this just like young people like boxing themselves in, and, you know, are they limiting themselves in some way? Anyway, that was the video I made last week, kind of reflecting on that trend in our communities. And since then, I've been contemplating that, and I want to talk about a phenomenon that I think is linked to that in some way. And it's related, I think, broadly. Both the micro-identity thing and this thing I want to talk about now are related really broadly to this idea that being a witch is a process. Like, we're always kind of constantly becoming witches, in the sense that we are learning and developing, and we're repeating narratives about our origins. And, you know, there's always kind of this question, I think, for a lot of people about what does it mean to be a witch? Is it about how much you practice? Are you practicing enough? Are you practicing the right things? Does it matter if other people think you're a witch? Like, how do labels kind of play up in this idea of personal identity? Like, all of these things to me are related to these wider questions about witchcraft essentially being a process. And if you've ever studied, like, religion really broadly, if you've looked at something like conversion, like in evangelical spaces, for example, conversion is never just like this single event that happens and then it's done. It's a process, in the sense that practitioners, through the process of testimony, they're sort of constantly becoming, over and over again, reaffirming their conversion, telling the narrative, right, through testimony. So in that sense, conversion is always kind of ongoing. And I've made the observation in the past that this is a thing that happens in witchcraft spaces too, even though we don't have like testimonies per se, and we very rarely use words like conversion. There's still this tendency to point to not just like moments where we discovered witchcraft, but ways in which we have always been witches and must constantly reaffirm that we are witches by engaging in certain practices in certain communities. It's a really interesting phenomenon. It's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. But anyway, related to all of that, I'm thinking about how this thing that I run into, like, as an author, when I'm operating in like book world, through like interacting with reviews or doing presentations at workshops or just interacting with readers, and like even prior to becoming an author myself, when I was like evaluating books just as a reader, there's this phrase, this kind of thing that comes up over and over again from people, which is basically like, I liked your book even though I'm not a Wiccan, or I really like this author even though they're this type of witch and I'm this type of witch. Or like, I really liked this book because it mostly reflects what I believe. There's this idea that like books on some level, we're supposed to kind of align with them, like point by point. And if we don't, that's somehow a problem. And books are just one example of that. You also see it on social media when people like, this is related to that micro identity thing, where like, hey, I'm interested in like being a green witch. Are there other green witches I can follow? And then you'll see people say things like, oh, you can follow this person, like they're a green witch, even though they also do these other things. And it's just kind of interesting because those differences are almost always presented as problems or flaws. And I think it's related to what I was saying just a second ago about witchcraft being a process of becoming, in the sense that when we become witches, we, the collective we, and obviously like at an individual level, people are different, but I'm speaking in generalizations for a second. When we become witches, one of the things that we do, one of the ways that we speak about it is as kind of discovering something core about who we already were. So like, you used to see this all the time in like the 90s and early 2000s, where people would say, you know, I read Scott Cunningham's Wicca Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and I realized that it was what I already believed. So over and over again, we see these instances where people discover witchcraft, whatever that looks like for them, whatever type of witchcraft it is, and they'll say something to the effect of like, I realized this is who I already was, or this is the religion, you know, if that's the word you want to use, this is the religion that came the closest to who I was. And there's something about that strikes me as just being like very, I don't know if it's like an American tendency. It feels very American to me, but obviously as an American, like I'm in my bubble here, where there's this emphasis on the individual and the individual experience, and the process of joining a movement, becoming religious, subscribing to a tradition, whatever, isn't about learning something new or growing or developing. It's about discovering who you already are. It's really interesting. But anyway, like, I'm thinking about it in relation to books in particular, because this is a thing that I run into as somebody who is very frequently asked to recommend books or review books or whatever, where people are very concerned with only reading material that reflects who they already are somehow. Like, there's kind of, it's almost phobic, where we don't want to read books by people who are up to something different, or when we're evaluating a book, it's, I really liked this book, except that the author is Wiccan, except that the author is a traditional witch, except that this author is religious and I see myself as secular. Like, you know, I really loved this book, but I'm only giving it 4 stars because like it doesn't reflect my particular tradition of witchcraft. And I hope it's coming across that I'm not explicitly talking about books. I'm more talking about our approach to learning in the craft as a whole. I think that there is this tendency to stay within our particular bubbles, and it's not even just because like we're worried, like there's like, if I focus on one particular tradition, I'm not going to have the brain space to learn about others. I want to like put on some blinders and have a really narrow focus for the sake of my learning, like as a beginner. Like I don't think that that's what's going on most of the time. I think that it's related to that idea that witchcraft is about self-discovery on some level. And while I'm not saying that it's not, I really don't, I struggle with that perspective that becoming a witch is about discovering who we already are. To me, the coolest thing about practicing and about learning and about meeting other witches and reading witchcraft books and kind of like discovering a wider community is explicitly encountering that stuff that is different. I don't think that people are like inherently like, I don't think that there's some kind of like core essence of witchcraft that you either have or you don't, where it's a question of discovering it. I think that it's actually like an active choice. It's a thing that we move through, and we learn and we take steps forward, and we learn new material, and we encounter people who are different, and we either adopt new beliefs and practices or we don't. The beliefs and practices that we have change over time as we learn more, as we become different people. I'm certainly not the same sort of practitioner, let alone the same person that I was, you know, when I was 17 versus when I was 23 or 31 or 35 or whatever. Like, I think that sometimes we're limiting ourselves when we have this narrative of self-discovery versus the conscious act of becoming something consciously. And to me, like, one of the simplest ways to kind of observe that is in how we talk about books and like content creators online or something, where like, oh, I like this person, except that they check different boxes than me. And I don't think that that's something that we do consciously. It's something that I personally run into a lot, because I think it kind of, I've encountered this thing where like people are sometimes dismayed to find that I'm Wiccan. Like they'll engage with my content on some platform, or they'll read particularly The Witch's Path. Like if you're reading traditional Wicca, it's very obvious, like I'm writing about Wicca. But The Witch's Path is not about Wicca. It's about witchcraft kind of as a broad category. And I get messages with some frequency that are like, I was surprised to hear that you were Wiccan, or like I was going through your videos and like you have videos about Wicca, you know, like, and part of it is like the stereotypes that we have and kind of like the boxes that we're checking and putting ourselves into. But I think some of it is related to that narrative where like, there must be something inherently different about me being Wiccan than there is somebody who identifies as a green witch or a traditional witch or whatever, where like we can't interact with each other's like materials or conversations or thoughts. And I think it's so important to read stuff that doesn't check all of your boxes. It's so important. Yeah. Anyway, lots of thoughts, but fundamentally, I think all of this is related to assumptions that we have about discovering ourselves as already being witches and locating a kind of central, pure, like spiritual perspective that is somehow already inside of us, versus going out and consciously like engaging with something and making choices about what we will believe and what we will practice. Like to me, the really exciting thing about witchcraft is that conscious choice. So anyway, something I wanted to point out and chat about for a couple of minutes. I hope you all are well, and I will see you next time.